All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, January 11th, 1971, U.S. attorneys charged the Harrisburg Seven, which is a group of 7 religious anti-war activists led by former Roman Catholic priest Phillip Berrigan. What were they charged with? Well, they were charged with a conspiracy to kidnap National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and bomb steam tunnels in Washington, D.C., under some federal office buildings. As we will discuss, Berrigan was a longtime activist, anti-war agitator. This was one of many plots and schemes and confrontations with the government over the war in Vietnam, and then a long history and life and legacy of anti-war efforts. So here to discuss this moment, the plot to kidnap Kissinger, are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Do you want to start a little with Phillip Berrigan, a really fascinating character, someone we haven't, I don't think, touched on this show so far? What do we need to know about him? What an interesting mix.
Can I just say, I feel like this whole episode could be a movie.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe because I'm thinking of like Sister Act or whatever. But
oh, you were going comedy.
Think of like a priest and a nun trying to set off like bombs and dynamite in tunnels, and it seems so outlandish, but I would totally love it if it were a movie, just saying.
Yeah. Well, as the resident Catholic, I mean, Berrigan is a fascinating character. We don't often think about, first of all, Catholics in general, but Catholic priests and nuns as being part of these big political movements.
Roman Catholic, I mean, probably the stodgiest in my mind, right? I mean, come on. Yeah.
Well, it's so fascinating because you see pictures from another group that he was involved with, the Catonsville Nine, which he also got arrested for, where they had broken into a Army field office and they had stolen all these draft records, and then they had put them on fire with napalm. And the group of people that are circling this trash can that's on fire are all in Roman Catholic garb, right? There are priests wearing collars, there are nuns wearing habits, and there is a kind of incongruity because you're not used to seeing those images. But there is this strong tradition of left-wing Catholicism. I mean, it's much bigger in South and Latin America with liberation theology, but there were people like Berrigan, who during the Vietnam War, I think it's fair to say, were radicalized by their opposition to the war and the inability of political systems to stop the war. There had been so many protests, there had been so much activism, and so as the war continued, his methods got more and more extreme.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the cover in a way that, someone from a priest offers to, so much of the story of Vietnam activism was about a generational divide, about, gap between kids and their parents. And so to have a priest as part of in your circle and say, well, look, this is, it's possible to have an expansive vision of what it means to oppose the war, I think is really interesting. And I think a big part of it too. But I think about Berrigan and I think about, we've talked so many times about abolitionists, and the sort of like legacy of the sort of religious call towards justice. And so it's incongruous, but it also feels very much like we've had that throughout this country's history.
Yeah, civil, very much, well, this isn't necessarily civil disobedience, but the sort of like radical protest, I think, is a part of that narrative. I do think that it's hard, I think, to picture all of this because we think that religious officials are pacifists or that they are not going to ever use violence or force as a way to prove their point. But according to Berrigan, you can be anti-war and still use force as a way of compelling people to stop.
I'm curious, Kellie, as someone who studies violence used by abolitionists for a just cause. What do you make of someone like Berrigan using violence to stop a war?
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I think there are people who are like William Lloyd Garrison who are hands down never wanted to use violence. But I think people understood it as a form of protection, that you were using violence to stop violence. And so if you're looking at it in that way, it doesn't hold the same sort of like destructive ideas in your head because you're trying to stop a greater destruction. And sometimes force or even violent force is required to do that. But people had biblical rationales in their head about how they justified using this force and using violence to stop it.
Yeah. We did that episode about the bombing at the University of Wisconsin, Sterling Hall, and we heard from, and in there you heard from a bunch of people saying, we're using violence to stop a greater violence, and that feels like justified to us. Yes, we're pacifists. Yes, we're anti-war, but, a violent act to stop a greater injustice feels justified here. So let's go to this scheme, this plot, and I suppose we should also kind of point out that this can be, add this to our ongoing list of failed schemes in American history, which seems to be like our most consistent story that we revisit. Maybe we'll like compile them all into one big long special or something. But
again, I see this as a movie. Yeah. I see them in a room gathered together, and they basically plan to get maps and diagrams of the underground tunnels in Washington, D.C. that have all like the heating systems of the government buildings. And then they were going to put dynamite charges in those buildings and detonate them at 5 different locations in order to make the buildings inoperable. And then they were going to kidnap Kissinger. The plot like gets more and more complex, but it's just wild to see how they're getting this all together or attempting to get it
and what
together.
You laid out is what the government says was being plotted and what Hoover says is being plotted. And I think when it goes to trial, that's the case being made. As I think is often the case, as I've learned when we do our failed schemes in American history shows, there's a real murky territory between how real was this plot, how, how legit was this? The government always wants to say they were right on the brink of executing this masterfully. And I think sometimes history says, well, people were just mouthing off or whatever. So, what, Niki, what is your sense of like, were they right on the cusp of kidnapping Kissinger?
They certainly were dedicated to the proposition of big, bold, and violent acts in order to end the war. This plan doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think there's a real connection between dynamiting these tunnels and then the next day they go and they kidnap Kissinger, which seems like really bad planning. People are going to be at high alert. How are you going to get Kissinger? Like, have you been following his schedule? Do you have some way of overcoming whatever securities around him? Like, it's not a plot that seems to have the finer grained details worked out. So were they about to kidnap Kissinger?
Neither was the Vietnam War, to be fair. No one had really thought through the details of how that one was going to work out. But yes, a bunch of people who don't really know what they're
military,
doing. That's true.
So they were.
But there is accusations in the trial, and I think evidence that they actually did enter these tunnels to scout them out and get their hands on some plans. And so yes, it is right on that line. It does go to trial, and I think generally, we should say that Berrigan and a couple others do end up imprisoned, but not exactly. I don't think this exactly counts as a win for the government. So how does this play out in trial?
Well, to me, it's interesting how the lead defense attorney, Ramsey Clark, sensed that a jury would be sympathetic to seeing priests and nuns and thought that sympathy would sort of, work in their favor. And so he doesn't call anybody to the stand. He only gets up and says, quote, "Your Honor, the defendants shall always seek peace. They continue to proclaim their innocence. The defense rests." And I'm like, wait, what? That's it?
Another good movie scene.
I know, right? But the trial ends with a hung jury. So it's not as though they have a complete acquittal, but they don't have much of a defense.
Yeah, it's fascinating because, well, first of all, in a trial today, a priest might not elicit the same kind of sympathy that the priests in the early 1970s were eliciting. There was just such a disjuncture between the idea that, these humble priests and nuns could possibly do this. But Clark also doesn't want to call them to the stand, because if he calls them to the stand, they're going to say things like, we burned draft cards and we made napalm and all of these different sorts of things that is going to undercut that sympathy really quickly, because the U.S. in the early 1970s still has a very large group of people who oppose the anti-war movement. So it's actually a pretty genius move by this defense attorney, and it works. The only thing that they end up going to prison for is, I think at this time, for secretly passing along letters that they weren't supposed to sneak along, which we should say, including love letters between the priests and one of the nuns.
Well, yeah, of course. If this is gonna be a movie, you have to have that forbidden love angle there, which actually, is one of the more fascinating parts of the Berrigan story. Yes, they're passing letters, and that's what they go to jail for, is illegally smuggling letters in and out of a federal penitentiary. Berrigan marries a nun, is excommunicated for the church for that. One interesting thing is they're married for 29 years. 11 of those years in their 29-year marriage, one of them or the other is in jail. They just live this life of activism and continually getting arrested and so forth. So yes, it has this fascinating coda and love angle.
Over a third of their marriage. That's commitment.
Yeah. Well, it's commitment to a cause, and I suppose to each other through that cause. Yeah. And I also think one other element here is the story that starts to rise up in the early 70s of just sort of FBI spying and sort of the way that the FBI tries to infiltrate groups like this. And we've talked about this a number of times. Everyone from John Lennon to the Weathermen to the Black Panthers, and that's happening here too. And I do think a lot of those stories often end with egg on the face of the government. And in this case, spending $2 million to prosecute this group and it being really high profile. And at the end, all you get them for is passing some illegal love letters in and out of prison. I do think that's part of a piece of a larger story.
Absolutely. And that's going to come out just a few years later, that the federal government has been spying on American citizens. And it's a huge scandal. But this story is part of that one, too.
Yeah. Ramsey Clark, by the way, can we go back to Ramsey Clark, who was an attorney general in this country and then served as the defense attorney here? Listeners, go down the Ramsey Clark rabbit hole when you have a chance. We will revisit his career at some point, because it is remarkable when you look at the list of people that he offered legal counsel to, including also some civil rights activists and so forth. But anyway, sorry. Felt important to mention that. Can I tell you one other thing I'm thinking about with this story?
Yeah.
We don't get together and name ourselves the place we're from and then number of people in the group anymore, you know?
Agreed.
We should just, I mean, Berrigan was part of Catonsville 9. He was also part of the Baltimore 4. He was also part of the Harrisburg 7. I mean, there's a nice simplicity there. Get some friends together, be from a place, and that's all you need. You don't need a fancy name for your clique. Just where you're from and how many of them there are. It is tough to bring people in or lose people, you know? You got to do a one-to-one swap if someone wants to come in, because you got to keep that number.
Nowadays it's like the Zoom 7.
This podcast is the Zoom 3. Yeah, that's exactly
That's right.
The Google Meets 9.
That's amazing. Oh, by the way, this Baltimore 4, which is one of the groups that he was a part of, and that so we mentioned obviously the Harrisburg 7 was this group we're talking about. The Catonsville 9 was the ones that Niki mentioned, the group that broke into an office and burned some materials. The Baltimore 4 staged a protest in which they broke into, I think it was a draft office, took out stuff, and poured blood over the documents, their own blood, so that in advance of this, they had gotten together and withdrawn their own blood, and they also had some fake blood. And then there was a whole story about one of the guys was like, I don't know if I want you to use my blood. Like, I'll give you blood, but I don't want you to pour it in public over this. Anyway, it was just like a very intense protest. That was the Baltimore 4, yes. But anyway, that was, gives you a sense of how committed and, radical activism that Berrigan was involved in throughout his career.
I guess it's worth mentioning as we wrap up that after the Vietnam War ends, obviously he continues to be a political activist. The next thing that he focuses on is nuclear weapons. And this becomes a huge issue in the 1980s. And he repeatedly goes to jail for things like messing with defense systems and is involved in this non-pacifistic pacifist group, his plowshares operation. He wants to beat those swords into plowshares, but at first he wants to use them as swords.
Yeah. We didn't mention that he was a vet, that he had fought in World War II. I mean, it's worth, it's just an interesting part of the mix there.
There is a documentary. I mean, I haven't seen it, but I don't know if a documentary is as exciting as what I want it to do.
It's the movie script you've been writing.
What I want to see, but there is a documentary you can watch about it. Yeah,
for sure. All right, let's wrap it up there. Hollywood, you have the seeds of a pitch here. You could. Kelly's very easy to track down if you need a story consultant.
I need a 2% finder's fee. Just saying.
There you go. All right. But yeah, this is a fascinating character, fascinating story, and lots of other sort of tentacles and ripples that I'm sure we will revisit. But Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you as always.
My pleasure.
Father Phillip Berrigan and Sister Elizabeth McAllister were sentenced today in connection with the Harrisburg 7 case. A federal judge ordered Berrigan to serve 2 years and Miss McAllister 1 year. They were the only two convicted in that alleged plot to kidnap Henry Kissinger, and they were convicted on a peripheral charge involving a little-used law, smuggling letters from prison. The jury did not agree on the conspiracy charges themselves, and the government said it will ask dismissal of them.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.